really any species of Acer in the genus Acer, so any species of maple, can be used for maple syrup production if the temperature and climate are right. And one species that we have an abundant amount of all across the maple producing region is red maple. Plenty of producers use red maple as crop trees for maple production, along with their sugar maples if they have them growing in the stands that they tap for maple production. But there are some sort of holdover barriers to some producers really feeling comfortable adding or using red maple as a crop tree. And so what we're trying to do with this project is to actually collect some data, some real empirical scientific data, to dispel some of those, what we almost like to call myths about red maple, to make producers more comfortable and confident to use them as crop trees, because they provide, using them as a crop tree provides so many different potential benefits for forests, for maple producers, on multiple different levels.
How are you collecting this data?
One area that we're focusing on is with respect to yield. So the sugar content in red maple sap tends to be a little bit lower than in sugar maple, the sap in sugar maple. Historically speaking, before we added technologies like reverse osmosis to maple production, which is used to remove a lot of the water from sap before it gets to the evaporator, collecting red maple sap for syrup production could actually be a pretty inefficient process. So there was lots more water to remove, and many producers actually just wouldn't include that as a crop species because of basically the amount of fuel that it would require to make syrup out of that. And in part because of that lower sap sugar concentration, there is a thought, or sort of almost a feeling, that red maples produce less syrup overall than sugar maple. But most of the producers that use red maple as crop trees pretty much know that the yields end up being about the same as sugar maple. So they tend to have lower sap sugar concentration, but they produce way more sap. So at the end of the season, it tends to be about the same overall syrup yield as sugar maple. But the problem is, we don't, at least up to now, we didn't have any hard scientific data to prove that that was true. So one of the objectives of this project is to actually quantify the actual yields from red maples when using modern sap collection practices like high levels of vacuum, really good sanitation, and things like that. So hopefully we will have some good numbers to document that the yields from red maple are pretty much the same, if not identical, to sugar maple.
Would a consumer be able to tell the difference between syrup from a red maple as opposed to syrup from a sugar maple?
Well, that is an excellent question, and actually segues into the second part of this study. So one of the other perpetuated myths about, or ways of thinking about red maple, is that somehow the flavor of syrup they produce is either different or inferior, or that perhaps they make that late season buddy off flavor earlier than red maples. And there's actually zero data to support any of that. And certainly, again, we have this case where lots of sugar makers who are using red maple as crop trees already are like, they have the experience that they don't see a difference or any impact on flavor. But without the hard data to support that, it's really hard to say, oh yeah, it's perfectly fine. What we're going to do, and this will be next year that we'll do this study, we're actually doing a controlled side-by-side experiment in which we have sap collected from purely red maples and purely sugar maples in the same stand, and we will process that sap into syrup simultaneously in our processing research facility, and then do the subsequent sensory analyses to see, is there a detectable difference in the flavor of syrup made with red maple and sugar maple sap, so that we will have some kind of, again, scientific data to support what we already really believe is true.
So there's probably a good chance that we've had red maple sap mixed in with our regular maple syrup and just didn't know it.
Oh, more than 100% chance. Wait, that's impossible. for certain that you have had syrup that's been made with red maple sap, but we tap on a lot of red maples at Procter. So, and lots of producers use them as crop trees. So you've definitely had red maple syrup for sure.
How did you get interested in this? What was the scientific interest that you had in this?
One of the big draws to it is that it's just one of those things that is not known, and we really do need to have some hard data behind it. Red maple, because it is so adaptable to different sites and growing conditions, it is actually one of the species that we look to for the future as we have a warming climate and things are changing in the maple producing region. As things become less favorable or conditions become less favorable for sugar maple, red maple is likely to be a very, very important crop species for maple production in the future. We need to know as much as possible about red maple, both its yield as well as the flavor that it makes, because it will be definitely a very important crop species for the maple industry to adapt and mitigate against climate change for the future.